Hi, I'm Tom, and you are tuned in to Hit the North, a podcast where I talk to a range of special guests, sharing their thoughts and feelings about the North, defined inclusively. Justin Lewis has an encyclopedic knowledge of popular music and a deep understanding of what makes it such a passion for so many people, as well as a lovely and sharp sense for what can sometimes make it eccentric and absurd. Those are the words of his publisher. They're right. Justin has been a freelance writer, editor, and researcher for over 2 decades. And as When Is Births, he has produced artworks and he edits the brilliant text cast, First, Last, Anything, with different guests each time, compiling related Spotify playlists and designing C90 cassette-like sleeves. The fellow is a man of dates and a music radio boffin. Hello, Justin.
Hi, Tom.
Thanks for joining us on Hit the North today. I'm going to start with just, I think, a very apt reading from your previous book, which I've got here, Don't Stop the Music.
Mhm.
A Year of Pop History, One Day at a Time, 7th of September 1987. Meanwhile, in one of the more unlikely double bills in music history, the stage is set at the National in Kilburn, London, for an evening with rock and roll revivalists Shawadi Wadi and German industrial noise band Einstürzend Nerbaten. I don't think we can really comment on that as such, but
It's one of the great. Apparently, Shawadi Wadi were very professional, and it's an interesting. I mean, I love things like that. Is it the Monkees supporting the Jimi Hendrix Experience or the other way around? I can't remember now.
yeah,
Obviously, what we know now about the Monkees is that there's not that big a gap between them and the Jimi Hendrix Experience. But at the time, that must have seemed an odd pairing. I think to people who'd only really seen the Monkees TV show and would have,
yeah.
I think that would have been a cracking night out. I mean, I didn't go to it, obviously. I didn't live in London for a start, but it's interesting to see those things. Had Shawadi sampled much of the work of the band they were supporting, or I've never seen them interviewed about any of the members, to my knowledge, have been asked about what it was like or anything like that.
Yeah, I think your books are full of these odd juxtapositions, really, that things you wouldn't expect to have been happening simultaneously. Say that's a good feature of them. Anyway, have you lived more than 5 years of your life in the North?
Oh, I wish I could say I have. I haven't. For about a year in my mid-30s, I lived in the East Midlands. And it was North Nottinghamshire, actually. So if it had been, I think it would have been another 20 miles north of that, I probably could say I'd lived in the North. I mean, that's a good question, isn't it? Where does the North begin? And I'm sure it's a question that you've chewed over in these conversations. Because obviously, it's easy to say where the northern end of the North is. It's easy to say where the west and the east of the North are, because obviously you've got the sea, the southern border of the North, and that's probably a slightly more difficult.
Some people do include Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire as the North because they're pretty industrial.
Derbyshire was the one I wondered about. I wondered, is that the North or not?
And then Cheshire has been debated as well, but I think Cheshire definitely is.
Oh,
really.
Yeah.
And then maybe they're not Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire aren't quite, but you see culturally there are lots of similarities to Sheffield, say, in that area. Chesterfield, I think it's East Midlands as well, isn't it? But it's probably quite similar feeling to South Yorkshire.
See, I would have said that was the North, but it's very, very hard to say. But and this will become clear in the conversation that my relationship with the North has often been quite a distant one, but quite profound. It's just not been geographical, really.
Yeah. So where have you lived?
Well, funnily enough, my accent will not suggest this at all. But I grew up in Swansea, which is where I live again now. I went to Cardiff to go to college. I stayed there nearly 8 years. I lived in London for about 15 years. and then I moved back to Wales again. So
Hmm.
I don't have a Welsh accent really, and I never have had, as far as I can remember. Sometimes I wish I did. I really like the Welsh accent, but I've never had one. The rest of my family have them, and I mean, my brother used to
Hmm.
have friends who used to say things like, "Why is your brother English?" or "Why has your brother got an English accent?" Because like, uh, and and the only thing I can say as an explanation is that I used to watch a lot of television when I was a kid, and a lot of television in those days didn't really have regional accents on them. It was all very RP on television. And I'm sure that's where I learned a lot of the speech patterns. But my accent
Yeah.
isn't quite RP either. So it's a slightly strange mixture. And apparently I only really go Welsh when I get indignant.
In a way, that's probably similar to me, but the influence of media and television probably did take me away from having a Macam accent. I
Yeah.
would say I'm northern, but I sound very southern to a lot of people in the northeast. But then I'd sound northern
Right.
when I went to Cambridge to study English in the early 2000s. I did sound northern to them. So a
You
lot of
do sound quite northeastern
southerners.
to me, so I wouldn't have. It's interesting, isn't it, though, because
Mm,
everybody has a different line, I suppose. It depends.
yeah,
Also, I think it depends if you live in different places. It's funny how your voice can adapt to being somewhere else, and you pick up speech patterns. And
mm,
it is all. But yeah, I for somebody who's lived basically for what 40 years. I'm 55, so I've lived 40 years in Wales, and you'd never guess,
yeah.
really.
Three
So yeah,
quarters of your life,
I
pretty
know
much. Yeah.
it's nuts, isn't it? But yeah, there it
Uh,
is.
Right. What are your most notable memories of school, would you say?
Well, I actually found school quite difficult. I was sort of quite bright, or considered quite bright, until I was in my teens, really. And it sort of made it slightly easier to know that I'm probably neurodivergent. I think that's still pending, but I think I found that environment quite difficult to study in. And when I got to higher education, which I managed to get into that eventually, I found it a lot easier because you could work on your own a lot more. You could kind
Yeah.
of come and go. I found it very difficult, 30 people in a class or whatever. But actually, and I'm not proud of this at all, but I think I probably learned more at home watching TV and reading and listening to the radio. And I got more from that. I feel like I remember so little from being in the class at school. And I was quite an early
Yeah.
reader, apparently. But it wasn't all bad. I was in the school orchestra. I quite enjoyed that. I had friends. It was okay, but I used to find it quite stressful, and I used to find exams really stressful. And I mean, in those days, it didn't feel like an environment that you could confide in people very easily. I think now,
No.
if I was at school now, obviously there'd be different pressures, but I get the impression that teachers are a lot more capable of understanding difficulties.
And what was the moment in your life that you knew you loved music?
Well, I suspect it was always there. I mean, there are stories in my family that there'd be various recordings playing at our house, and I would try and imitate some of the instruments on the records. I started learning the flute when I was about 8. And I've wondered for a long time why it was the flute. Why? I think possibly because I was quite a small person, and it just struck me that I mean, even the flute was quite big for me because I was a very short child. But I think I liked the fact that it was used in jazz because my dad played a lot of jazz at home, and but also you just heard it a lot in TV music and orchestral music as a color. I've grown fonder of it as a solo instrument as time gone on, but I think I liked it as a sort of an ensemble instrument then. I must have been fairly serious about that, about the flute, because I went to lessons for like 10 years and did all the grades and everything. But I knew that I was never going to be a professional musician because I think that requires you to have an extra commitment. And also it requires you, I think, to have patience and I think even fearlessness to really go with that sort of career. And I don't think I had
Yeah.
that as a musician. But I did enjoy playing, and I learned saxophone as well to be in bands really, and that was okay for a while. I started buying records when I was about 10, but I mean I'm sure
Mm.
it was in my bones really.
And what about like writing?
I didn't really think about it at all until I had a teacher at junior school called Pam Thorpe who died a few years ago. And she was only actually briefly a teacher at our school, like half a term. And I think we must have been given an assignment to write a story or something. And She really, really liked it. She read it to the class. For many years, I just kept bumping into her in our village because she just was around. And she always asked me if I was still writing. She always asked me if I was still writing. This was based on like 7 weeks of teaching. And when I was about 40, I wrote to her to sort of thank her for all the early support because I've just gone freelance. And also, I suddenly thought this is the moment to do it because I might not, you never know, you might be too late. You just want to try and get people while they're still here and thank them.
Yeah.
And she replied by letter initially, but enclosed the story. She kept it. She kept the story.
That's great.
And she said that what she did when she was teaching at other schools was she'd often use that as an example of what kids were capable of. And it's ironic because I don't really write fiction, but it's interesting that that made an impact. And I met her family at her funeral and was able to tell them that that really was an important, that early support. And in fact, the new book is partly dedicated to her.
You worked as a radio presenter. When and where was this? How would you describe the experience?
Okay, well, when I was 16, I got into hospital radio. I wanted to actually get into it when I was 40, but you couldn't. It was something to do with insurance, really. If if you'd had an accident in the hospital, or if you weren't covered by insurance, that was one of the reasons they gave. I also think you need to at least be old enough to realize what you're doing, even at hospital level. Like, it's not because it's not really about you. It's about the service you're providing. It's about you're part of the team. It's not about getting your own show or anything like that, really. And in fact, there was a ban on calling when you're on hospital radio. If you had a program of your own, you're not allowed to call it your own show. You had to come up with a title that didn't have your name in it. So I think it's probably good, because you realise then it's not about you. Anyway, did hospital radio. I'd been doing that for about 18 months, and then one of the friends I'd made there, who's still one of my best friends now, she had managed to get some work at the local radio station, which was called Swansea Sound, and was the first bilingual independent local radio station in Britain. It was only the fifth or sixth in the whole country, I think, but it was the first that had Welsh and English broadcasting. So anyway, she was working on various programs on that, and there was a youth program on Sundays, 3-hour program, and she was great on it. But one of the things I heard when I was listening to it was I thought, oh, it's 3 hours. They probably need people. Whereas if it had been a half-hour show, I wouldn't have thought of it. But because it was 3 hours and they were playing music I generally liked, and it seemed to be slightly different from what the station normally did. So I wrote to the producer. Maybe I thought I was going to do reviews or something. I don't. And my friend must have put in a word for me as well, I'm sure. But anyway, the presenter producer asked me to write a commentary for the following week, like almost like a kind of audio column. So I wrote this thing, which was kind of factual based with some opinions in it, but also I must have put some humorous things in it because when I was reading it, he sort of laughed in the right places where the humorous stuff was. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I started doing that. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, I suddenly just went, oh, wow, this is amazing. I could do anything here. And they knew I wasn't going to swear. They knew I wasn't going to slander anybody. So I did a sort of 5 or 7 minute piece every week, really, for about a year and a half. And that was in the time leading up to me leaving to go to university. So I was still quite young when I was doing that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we were getting many listeners, to be honest with you. I do remember now, in a way that I didn't really understand at the time, that we did have to keep changing the format of the program. Now I think about it, every sort of 6 months or every 3 months, it might even have been whenever the new listening figures came in, there was suddenly a sort of a decision to reshape the program. But they tended to leave me alone with what I was doing. I was still able to pretty much do what I wanted. But it was a real privilege because there really weren't many ways of getting started if you wanted to do anything like that. I mean, there was basically fanzines. I mean, you sometimes would read somebody in a newspaper. It'd be a 17-year-old who'd written a piece, and then you discover ages later that they were the son or daughter of somebody who worked on paper or someone who was in journalism. So you'd see that happen. This is why local radio was really important. I mean, it was, because it was down the road. That's the thing. It was not far away. It wasn't like London. London might well have been the moon. You couldn't
accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you thought to yourself, oh, that's doable. There was no money in it or anything like that. You got paid expenses, but that experience was extraordinary. And even though it didn't really lead to anything immediately afterwards, the fact that I've done that was really helpful in terms of making me think, well, I've done that, so it means I probably could do it again.
Do you have any recordings of any of them? Or?
Somewhere, yeah. One of the people who worked on the show literally has like a full like archive apparently of every show.
Wow.
I don't know if I'd want to hear them in a weird sort of way. You sometimes don't look back too much, I think. It's a good rule of thumb.
So we're jumping forward quite a few years for the next question. Do you have any notable or bizarre anecdotes about writing the vast doorstopper history of the Radio 4 satirical show Weekending in 2008 alongside Ian Greaves? Now, this book is too big for me to bring upstairs, I would say.
Yeah,
I do have it.
You really could cause people injuries with it. I think it was. I mean, the whole thing was a slightly bizarre experience, really, because it was relentless. I mean, it was a year of our lives, slightly more than a year, actually. The really weird irony of it being that neither of us are particularly big fans of it. And the reason we started working on it was that, well, we were working on a few projects, really, and we kept interviewing people who said, well, I did 6 months on Weekending. And their reactions to doing that were quite varied. So some of them really enjoyed it. Some people found it absolute hell. And we were just really intrigued by that because while still understanding that it was a brilliant first port of call for anybody who wants to get started. Because if you look at who came through it, it's quite a list. You know, Douglas Adams came through it, Newman and Baddiel, Ian Herring, Andy Nucci produced it for a few weeks. You know, I mean, David Renwick, Andrew Marshall, will appreciate it's very much white men. It does seem to be that's the era it was.
Yeah.
For a long time, it did sort of mean that, in theory at least, anyone could write like a quick news line and send it in from anywhere in the country, and it might get read and it might get on. And you could get, you know, not paid a lot, but the fact you could get paid something for writing the joke was a really, really important thing. And it got a lot of people started in comedy. I mean, you know, you look at a Weekending writers list for any given week. And by the way, this book did have an episode guide for 1,132 episodes, I think. So, yeah, I think we came off that one and said, I don't think we're going to do an episode guide again.
It's got incredible detail, that book.
It had to, though. This is the thing. Once you start really thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? Because it's not an easy story. I mean, we did write a sort of a through line story of how it worked, and we'd interviewed a lot of people. But in the end, you still have to say, well, look, how did it? Because there were so many subtle changes that happened from episode to episode. It's the story of radio light entertainment, really, which I think is an area that isn't written about enough. Really, really proud we wrote it, even though it's a very strange book to say that you've written. It was an amazing thing to do. Yeah. Yes.
And the next question will be on this. So this is James Leggett and Jamie Sexton's book, No Known Cure, the comedy of Chris Morris. And I had a read of this recently. I think, you write a really good chapter on Chris Morris's radio work specifically.
Oh, thank you.
And there's excellent points about his very endearing oral graffiti over tracks that he's playing at his 1994 music show on Radio 1.
Yeah.
Which I have heard of all of that when I got into Chris Morris's show. I got bootlegs, I remember, of all of those. About 30 shows, isn't it, I think?
That's right, yeah.
I picked up the cash flow. Then we played bones, and I'm yelling domino. Plus nobody I know got killed in South Central LA. Today was a good day. Left my homie's house paid. Picked up a girl, been trying to dig since the 12th grade.
And also his like irreverent cross-cultural juxtapositions, which are carried right through to Four Lions, say. It brings to mind Michael Alexander St. John's sort of countdowns in Blue Jam, which are superb. And the combining of an unusual register of all these bizarre sort of things that he's saying.
He was a fascinating man, Michael Alexander St. John. I mean, he died before we could ever get to interview him, but he was a really extraordinary presence. I knew the voice quite early on. He was a continuity announcer on HTV, which is my ITV region when I was growing up. He used to work out of HTV West in Bristol.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
and I don't know if 'cause Morris went to university in Bristol, and so I don't know whether he was just somebody who was watching television or local television or whatever, and God knows how he got to meet Michael Lance St John, but they did meet when he worked at Radio Bristol some years later. I think St John had that kind of sense of humour apparently as well. So he'd been an actor. So
Yeah.
you always think to yourself that people who are of a different older generation can't possibly understand what some of this is about. But I actually think there's quite often they get it. Actually, they quite often get
Yeah, I mean-
eccentricity more than anybody.
People of that generation would know the Good Show
Of
and
course,
Harold Pinter's work. So I think there's a lot of philosophical links with Chris Morris.
Absolutely.
Stuff. Yeah, and I also think you make a great point about how Blue Jam is better than Jam because you get the tracks being played as well in full. You get these ambient tracks and post rock and groove in full, and they're sort of equal with the sketches, and they really communicate with each other. Whereas Jam, I don't know, it has its great moments, and I loved it at the time. But when you listen to Blue Jam, it's just a completely different beast because of that.
Yeah, and I think it's weird. I mean, that show has disappeared from the consciousness a bit. I mean, actually, the TV show particularly, that's kind of been forgotten, whereas I think the radio show, I mean, it's only been repeated very sporadically, but anyone who wants to find it, it's very easy to find now. But one of the reasons I liked it was that I enjoyed that sense of mood about it. I didn't know what to make of it at all when I first heard it, because the first episode, the day it was going to go out, I happened to buy Time Out and they happened to link it. Because if you went to look at it in the Radio Times, and I was in those days buying the Radio Times every week, literally all it had in the Radio 1 schedule was 12 midnight, Blue Jam, producer Chris Morris, and you would easily miss that. But Time Out, luckily, did write a tiny little capsule in their radio section. And a few of us in the office just went, oh my God, because this had only been about 6 months after the Brass Eye thing had happened. So that was so exciting. I do miss him being on the radio, and I understand why he wouldn't do it now. But I think there was something so extraordinarily inventive about those shows. There were so many great moments, so many jaw-dropping moments. But actually, there was a great lightness of touch with what he did. I think the trouble is for people who might not know the radio work, who might only know the really sort of controversial TV stuff, the Brass Eye Special and so on, which actually is probably my least favourite thing he's done. But they might go to the radio stuff and go, oh, it's all a bit silly, a lot of it. But that to me is why I liked it. I like about 98% of what he did was just really silly. Wouldn't offend anybody, and it was only that 2% which he would sometimes throw in there, in the same way that Kenny Everett would do the same sort of thing. I often think sometimes he'd put those things in there without even really thinking through whether some of these things would cause trouble. I mean, I think by Radio 1 time, because he was on in the late evening, he could stretch that a bit more, and I think Radio 1, thankfully, by that point was generally left him alone. I think obviously there was the Heseltine thing, but I think they had to do something with that, because I think Matthew Bannister did a good job of saying, okay, you'll have to pre-record. But one of the things that's amazing about the pre-recorded stuff is that there's really no difference, really. I mean, the pre-records are just like, and the one that went out on Boxing Day is just insane that went out on daytime Radio 1 again, for anybody who hasn't heard it. But it was Boxing Day 1994, and that was a 2-hour sort of best of, but with extra stuff in it. God bless him for doing it. Great.
Why do you think Morris focuses on making films? So he's made 2 feature films and a short in 2 decades instead of doing radio. I mean, he doesn't owe us anything, and he can do what he wants. But there is something in me as a fan of his work which feels how natural he was for radio and how brilliant he was at it.
I think, though, that the funny thing about radio comedy is that one of the reasons it's so potent is that I think there are fewer ways that it can go wrong. Radio, you really only have to think about writing and sound and performance, and that's it, really. Everything else is in your imagination. I think the trouble with films, I think particularly for things that he does. And I must admit, I haven't seen, is it called The Day Shall Come, the last film? I haven't actually seen that.
Yeah, 2019.
Yeah, Four Lions is great. But I mean, his TV work is it's really, really ambitious, and some of it's really peculiar. But it's kind of, there's all sorts of ways that could not exactly go wrong, but there's more at stake, I think. Better example actually is that I always think when Armando Iannucci went off and did Friday Night Armistice or Saturday Night Armistice for BBC Two, which is essentially a television version of the show he'd been doing on Radio 1. And in a weird sort of way, the show on Radio 1 works better, I think, than Armistice does. Partly, again, because they have records, partly because they were playing music and messing about with that as well, messing about with the whole station. But I think when you put it on the scale of you put it in a studio and you have an audience and you've got to record it in a very short space of time, there's actually more potential for things to be a bit flabbier, I think. You can really do so much with live radio. In fact, I'm really surprised that people don't do this at the moment very much. There's not very many examples on the radio now of people who can do those sorts of programs. And when you think about it, it will be so easy to do. But actually, it just feels like, oh, we'll just play some records because that's what people want, which it must be because people listen to more radio than ever, apparently. There's very few people who you'd go, oh, I must listen to that because you don't know what they're going to do this week. You know,
No.
that used to be one of the, and I don't even mean in a controversial way, I just mean that they would have some amazing ideas or an incredible way of starting a program or finishing a program or just, do you know what I mean? It's like there's that sort of, that kind of unpredictability. And I liked the fact that people would really go for that. I don't know why they don't now. Even on stations where you think that they might, somewhere like Six Music, I don't get that sense of irreverence, which is always quite nice when you get that. I mean, even, Terry Wogan, I always think was a brilliant example of someone who was incredibly mainstream, but would actually throw these little weird bits in where you just think he's absolutely brilliant at that. You don't get so many people doing that now, unfortunately.
Yeah, a bit more playing it safe, I think, generally.
Yeah.
So now tell me about your 2024 book, Don't Stop the Music, which is a highly successful and I will say delightful book, tracking a labyrinthine history of music with events one day at a time over a calendar year, jumping about with all years, really.
Yeah, I got asked to do that. It's an extraordinary bit of good luck, that, because I've been doing various bits and pieces for the internet. I've been doing sort of art cards and things like that. People could order cards, usually to do with people's birthdays or events from a month or something like that. And I'd actually been thinking for a while about a book around something like that, but it was difficult to know how to get that off the ground. And then one day, I'm going to name him because he was so brilliant at getting it started. A man called Simon Spanton, who works in publishing, he said, "Can I give you a ring?" I said, "Yeah, great." He rang me and he said, "I'm asking you if you'd like to do something about pop music at this day in history for pop music and come up with like a few different events for each day of the year." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't realize this happened," because I've been, had some bad luck with publishing for a few years and there'd been nothing had been happening. So you were like, not only is something going to happen, but obviously if you get asked to do something, the chances of it actually coming out are quite high. If they're already half thinking about it, then you're already onto a winner, hopefully.
Yeah.
I mean, I had to pull it together quite quickly. I had about 6 months to do the whole thing. It was great because really, Elliot and Thompson, who published it, are just great. They let me get on with it. They didn't interfere with the content. They had some great editors, so they made sure that everything was correct. But in terms of what I was able to cover in that book, I wanted to bring it up to date. I wanted to try and do 21st century stuff as well as, So, I mean, although ironically, most of the people who have approved it or people who've enjoyed it do seem to be people who are, I would say, sort of 40 plus, I would say. I think I don't think it's, I love the idea that younger people might read it. As far as I know, that hasn't happened. Although if anyone's listening to this who is younger than that, they enjoyed it, please let me know. But I think it's essentially a book really that's from the sort of 50s, maybe the 90s, is kind of the that core period. No, I wanted to try and use up-to-date stuff as well, because I thought, well, that's the title, isn't it? Don't Stop the Music. I wanted to make it clear that it hasn't stopped. So yeah, it was
indeed.
that was important.
I think that's comes across in both books, really, but I suppose especially Don't Stop the Music, avoiding a sort of simplistic nostalgia perspective is really important, I think.
Yeah, I think, I just thought I wanted to tell the story a different way. I mean, obviously there are things where you think, well, I'll probably cover that, but you want to try and cover it in a way that hopefully hasn't been covered before, or at the very least give it an angle, or mix it up with another story that people might not know. And I always think it's a good sign if I don't know the story before I start. If I find out something in research, I think, oh, I didn't know that. That's going to go in. So very tempting to keep retelling the same story, but I don't think I'd find that very interesting. I don't think I find that very interesting as a reader either. I mean, one of the nicest things anybody wrote about it was someone described it as making trivia meaningful, which I thought was really nice, because it is trivia on one level, but on another level, I thought pop music is about so many other things. It does reflect the world in which it's being created, like any art form. And so I thought it would be good, and I hope we've done this with the new book as well, to try and tell you something about the world in which pop music was being created, what society's like,
There's great little biographical fragments that implicitly link together. Like, I think it's Eddie Cochran, it's his sort of working life influences the music in a way. And then there's Mary J. Blige as well, quite early on, with working on the phone line. Stuff.
Yeah.
And I was making the links between those. But it's not sort of done didactically at all. You just let people make of it what they will. It's very, very good.
Thanks. I think it's really, really nice to be able to. Well, everyone listens to music differently, firstly, but I also think everybody makes different connections. So in a way, making it fragmentary there's a nice fluidity to it. I mean, some people told me that the way that they would read that book, but they would look at it the way you'd look at a calendar or a diary. They would look at it on the day itself, and then they put it away. So they'd read it over a year, looking at it each day.
Yeah.
And I thought that was quite a nice way to do it. But equally, if somebody was saying I couldn't stop reading it, I had to go all the way through it. That, in a way, I mean, when I first delivered it, the bit of relief, because obviously when you first deliver a book, you're very nervous about how people will react to it. Simon, who I mentioned earlier, who greenlit the whole thing, he was the first to see the manuscript, and he said to me, "Oh, you've written the history of pop music, but in a different order," which is really nice, to sort of do that. And I mean, I have had a few people say, "Oh, why wasn't there an index?" But actually, we didn't want people to look up.
No.
We didn't want people to go, "Oh, you didn't have enough on that group," or "You didn't have my favorite group on in it," or whatever. I mean, God knows we tried. We tried to fit as many. It was all about trying to represent as many people as we could, while at the same time making sure that all the big names were in there. So you were, there was always that kind of that was the difficult bit when it came to editing, was trying to work out a balance of people and trying to make sure that you didn't have artists who were too involved, because you could, for example, theoretically have put a Beatles and Bowie one in for every single day of the year, and I thought, but I don't want to do that, even though they are in the book quite a lot. But I didn't want to make it top heavy like that, because I thought, well, people know that anyway.
And what did it feel like when you knew that it was selling well?
That's really funny. And actually, there is a North of England connection with this, because I went to see Ben Folds in York about 2 years ago. And the reason we chose York was that the friend I was going with to see the concert lived in Lancashire. And I thought, well, I can come up and I'll go and visit my friends in Leeds as well. And anyway, we were staying in our rooms above a pub in York. And they told us in the evening they were having a pub quiz, and that it could be quite noisy towards the end of the evening. I was like, well, we're going to a concert. It's fine. It's not a problem. Anyway, when we came back from the concert, we were going up the stairs, and I could hear the guy who was doing the pub quiz reading out some of the questions that night. And I thought, these are very familiar questions. These are very familiar subjects. One of them was about Brian Poole and the Tremoloes, which is not really a name you'll hear very often, even in pub quizzes now. But I realised that about 4 or 5 of these questions were things that were in my book. So the following morning, I got the name of the guy who was compiling the pub quiz, and I emailed him. I went, "Look, I realise this is going to sound a very strange question, but are you aware that there's this new book that I've written which has got these things out?" And he replied to me and he said, "Oh, yes, what it was that there was a tie-in feature on the book in The Sun a couple of Saturdays ago. So I just got the ideas from that." And I went, "Oh, wow." And that's when I realized that the book was doing quite well, because it's, regardless of what you think of mass market newspapers, the fact is a lot of people read them.
Already having an influence on pub quizzes for the good, probably.
Yes, I
Yeah.
think so. I think so. I mean, that was really unexpected. But I mean, I was so struck by how that happened that I thought, oh my goodness, this book has actually broken through beyond the friends of mine who will buy it dutifully and hopefully enjoy it.
So it has some wonderfully funny, odd, forgotten moments in music history. Like there's one, I'll just read it in full now. Page 119 to 120. 18th of May 1975. Chaos breaks out at Mallory Park in Leicestershire, where 50,000 fans have gathered to watch Slade, the Rebettes, and headlining act the Bay City Rollers. The Rollers are at the peak of their popularity. Bye Bye Baby has just been UK number 1 for 6 weeks, the biggest selling single of the year. The band are flown in by helicopter, but such is the intensity of their fan base, they're forced to land on an island in the middle of a lake. This does not stop their fans, who proceed to try and wade and swim through the lake to reach them. Many of them have to be rescued. Meanwhile, Tony Blackburn, covering the event for BBC Radio 1, is circling proceedings in a speedboat being steered by a man in a Womble costume.
I mean, when I was doing events for that book, I knew that was one that if I read it, it would get a laugh, because it's such an unlikely thing. And yet it kind of demonstrates to you the massive popularity of the Bay City Rollers, which was quite a short-lived thing, really. It was only a couple of years, really. But it was total. And so, yeah, that idea of having Radio 1 in Mallory Park with a speedboat, I really loved this idea. It's like motor racing. Radio 1 seemed to have this real thing about motor racing back in the day. I don't know why. That was a good one. Hopefully the new book's got a couple of those kinds of things in it as well.
It has, yeah.
Where you
Are there any other amusing tales you could tell us which you've not been able to fit into either of the books so far?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a lot of the ones that I found really, really interesting were some of the international stories, really. When I was working out what I was going to put in, a lot of it was trying to work out why certain types of music were big in certain places, why I was still really surprised to discover, for example, that with Jamaica, that actually reggae is not really necessarily the big music in Jamaica. What people know listening to is country music. Didn't know that at all. And so the things like that, where you find that out, or it was really interesting to read and research what it was like in the Soviet Union in the 80s about how pop music was seen and how the arrival of Gorbachev starts to change things a little bit, and how people start to tour Russia, but also things like Beatles albums coming out in Russia. And I mean, I realize I'm talking about things that are in the book and not things that aren't. But it's like, I mean, there was so much that didn't go in, and I was given an extra 10,000 words towards the end, so it was like I didn't have to cut too much out. What you couldn't do was go, "Oh, I haven't got much for November 1987, for example." That'll have to be a shorter entry. Once you've agreed to, you've got to try and find things that are interesting, which hopefully embellish the story.
You have great nuggets from interviews with artists as well. Like in the first book, Dave Stewart, Julian Cope on particular songs, and Billie Eilish as well.
Yes.
And that great Mushroom Biryani, John Peel, Billy Bragg story as well, which I remember hearing on air in the late 90s when Peel recounted it.
Yeah.
But to move on to your newest book. So is this published on the 2nd of October? Am I right?
That's right. Yes, that's right. Into the Groove, it's called. The 1980s, the ultimate decade in music history. And it's a month-by-month guide to pop in the 80s. So there's some stuff for every month of the decade. I want to try and make it, as I say, international. But at the same time, I wanted to try and explain why the world was getting a little bit smaller in terms of people being conscious of what else was going on, because it struck me that particularly in the early 80s, if you just looked at the British and the American charts, they could hardly be more different. And it's interesting how that starts to change. And it's partly because of MTV, but not entirely. And wanted to kind of get to the bottom of that. I wanted to try and find out at what point does that tip over? Was it, Tainted Love, or was it the Human League, or was it Duran Duran, or whoever? And, actually finding out more about how, for example, MTV dealt with programming black music, for example, which they weren't very good at doing or very interested in doing at the beginning.
Yeah.
Although I think what was interesting about that was discovering that for the first year, it was not on in New York. It didn't get added to Manhattan Cable until the last part of 1982. I think that's deeply significant, because from then on, it has to reflect a more urban environment. It was really only available to the Midwest in 81, first half of 82. Actually, MTV does actually start to cover more and more black music. It's partly through people like Michael Jackson, Prince, but it's also because hip hop starts to do with new rock and roll, with people like Run DMC are actually starting to, before they even start working with Aerosmith, they're making rock records effectively. And so that gets them MTV airplay. So that's the aim of the book, was to really try and just tell the story differently, because I felt very strongly that now when people talk about the 80s, they're talked about as if they're a single entity, and it's not at all.
No.
And certainly when I was in the 80s, we certainly weren't standing around going, "Oh, it's the 80s." Nobody did that. There were so many different versions of the 80s.
Yeah, I think it's a great book. I've read it recently.
Thank you.
I can thoroughly recommend it to all listeners. If it begs this question in the mind by music videos as well, because music videos come in so much, and to an extent adverts, and that there's a lot of scope to be critically analysing how music videos evolved in the 80s, definitely. And I don't think much is missing in it, really. I was thinking about all the artists I'm into from the 80s. They're all in there, really. There's a few who are a bit more obscure who aren't, but I'm not really going to name them. But it's really great detail. Like, you've got A.R. Kane in there with Anatina, which of course is part of the double A side single with Pump Up the Volume.
Number one single. Number one single, lest we forget. Official number one single.
Yeah, remarkable stuff. But which do you personally feel is the decade's ultimate year, and why?
I mean, I think it's either 81 or 89, because 1980 is like 1970-10, really. It's still the 70s. 81, I think you've got Adam Ant, you've got Spandau Ballet, who were the first British groups who have a different perspective from punk rock, I think, even though Adam had been a punk. But I think Adam and the Ants are a completely different version of that, really, by 81. As much as I love a lot of post-punk, and this is when I was doing the playlists for the book, I was thinking, God, 1980 is going to be gloomy if I'm not careful, because it's all brilliant, but post-punk is very, very gloomy at times.
Yeah.
And so there's this need for colour and glamour and some showbiz to come back. And actually there's that friction in the whole of the 80s, really, about whether pop music is entertainment or whether it's about messages. And obviously when it's really good, it's about both. So I think 81's important in that way. It's good in that way. But I think I would say 89 is really strong as well, because I would say more than any other year of the 80s, whatever you're into, there's lots of interesting stuff going on. So if you like your hip hop, there's Public Enemy and De La Soul. If you like noisy indie, there's Mudhoney and Nirvana and the Pixies. And if you like going to the Hacienda, then there's a guy called Gerald and Happy Mondays. But actually, and this is the bit that often gets missed out, if you like your singer-songwriters and CD quality music, you've got Costello and you've got the Blue Nile and Tanita Tikaram and, even Enya or something like that, because that's completely different. That whole world, which I don't think had been written about much when people write about the 80s. So I tried to do that as well. And obviously, if you like your chart pop, there's Kylie and there's Erasure and people like that. So I was very, very optimistic at that point about pop music. Heavy metal, there's, Iron Maiden or Guns N' Roses. Regardless of what your taste is, whatever you're into, there was probably some good stuff going on. I think it's a particularly good patch. I mean, I nearly said 88. Well, 88 is nearly as good. But I think 89, the fact that it ends really strongly is good.
I won't sort of spoil it, but the first and the last entries have this wonderful link which goes into 1990. But
Glad you noticed that. I'm glad that was a nice thing. That's one of the first things I set up. Actually, I thought, oh great, I've got a bookend that I can do. So yeah, that was great to be able to do that.
I think overall it's great, that you're including everything. You're not looking down on any genre, and you're trying to cover music from all over the world. I think that's all really good and important.
Yeah.
And you cover great funny stories like the Half Man Half Biscuit one and the Tube.
It was nice to get a date for that one. I'd never known exactly when it happened. So
31st of January 1986.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, both of your books have a fascinating implicit theme of music being entangled with politics, or indeed musicians being active in supporting many varied just causes.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to some of the people who would say, oh, music is just fun, it's just entertainment?
Well, I have some sympathy with that view, actually, because I do also think that life is, whenever possible, is about having fun as well. But I was a literature student at university at the turn of the 90s, and it was quite a political course, I suppose, in some ways. And we were told quite early on that every novel, every play, every poem was inevitably political because the people had written them and their lives directly or indirectly were part of that work. So even if you'd made a conscious decision to be imaginary or think you'd made a clean break with that, some of you would always be in that. That said, and this was always the problem with a book like this, is that there are records that are so primarily thrilling that what else is there to say but what a brilliant record. And sometimes records that have got good stories aren't necessarily good records. And sometimes records that are amazing, there isn't much to say about them really, except somebody made this record. So I think pop is there, not exactly there to educate or inform. Those aren't quite the right words, but I think so the BBC's original premise doesn't exactly work with pop. But I think sometimes it's good to have this idea that you can do anything with pop music. You can do a message song, like The Message, for example, or you can do a record about dancing or sex, or it can be about anything you want. But I like the freedom of the art form to do that, because nobody says, oh, cinema shouldn't cover subjects to do with the world, do they? So it's quite nice to. I think pop music, it depends. It depends how you do them as well. I mean, there's lots of very upbeat records which aren't what they appear to be. So there's that as well. Sometimes it's only when you listen to the words you realise what you're actually dealing with.
And the political songs can be joyous as well, like Jerry Dammer's Free Nelson Mandela. That's a great song. It's danceable.
I mean, that's an interesting example there of, I wonder what would have happened if that had been a downbeat record. The Special AKA had made a few singles before that were quite confrontational and quite difficult, and were never going to be massive hits. But it's as if with Nelson Mandela, they suddenly thought, I don't actually know whether they thought, we've got to make this a hit. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just thought, well, it's the obvious thing to do is to make it up tempo and to make sure people might dance to it and not necessarily even know. Not sure I knew who Nelson Mandela was when I first heard it, which was 1984. But very quickly it becomes, oh, this is what it's about. And Dammers claims that when he first went to the Nelson Mandela 65th birthday party in London in 1983, he claimed in an interview not long after that he didn't know who Nelson Mandela was prior to that. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds like he said it early enough in the story for me to think, well, why would he say that if he didn't think it? So that is really interesting. It's as if they needed to make that a hit to make people aware of it. Because if that hadn't been a hit, would people have known about it? Would he have been freed?
Yeah, and that's
as early as he was. You do start to ask these questions about it. So I don't know. It's a good one. That it's good.
Touches on the impact of the music, doesn't it? And it was interesting how there's certain artists you wouldn't have expected at all to be political, like were at times, like Anna's pronouncement about human rights that I learned about through your book, Chile and El Salvador, as well as Poland.
Yeah.
And the Rolling Stones, Under Cover of the Night, being about human rights abuses. I didn't know that at all. So it's a very educative book in that way. And my next question was to sort of move towards the north. What do you think defines northern music, and have there been key historical shifts?
Whoa. Yeah.
Big question.
I mean, it's a big question. I don't know if I have a big answer. The trouble is, a lot of it is that I realise that a lot of my favourite artists have come from the north, but they've actually relocated to do what they did. So, I mean, the first group I ever loved was the Police. And obviously Sting is from Wallsend, I think. And I didn't know this for years, was at the same school as Neil Tennant. But they've only about 3 years between them. But they had to go to London to really make their mark. New Order did not do that, or Joy Division. ABC didn't really do that. And the Human League didn't either. So there's that thing of how bands like that were creating these little areas of music. It's the other thing, a lot of these groups don't really have anything in common, even though they are in the same place. You know, you've got in Manchester in the early 80s where you've got the Smiths and New Order and the Fall, and they're sort of bracketed together. They actually don't really have that much in common, really. Musically, they don't. Anyway, they all sound completely different from each other. Sometimes I think, I don't know whether it's that geography sometimes gets overstated with this, because I think what does make people create these things is, I think, this defiance that you don't have to be in London to do it. You don't have to move there. You can be anywhere. I don't know if that's quite so easy now, ironically, given that the internet's there. Somebody mentioned the other day, and I've now forgotten the name of the group, but they mentioned about how there's so few entries on the Mercury Prize shortlist that are from outside London.
Yeah.
They all seem to be based in London now. I don't know how true that actually is, but that's what I've been reading. And that didn't used to be the case. When you'd read the music press, there was very much this feeling that any major city in the country, Swansea's not a good example here, unfortunately, most big cities had a big music scene that was doing original things, but they're not necessarily the same sort of music. I mean, it's weird to think, for example, that when you talk about somewhere like Sheffield, and who were the big groups of the early 80s coming out of Sheffield? The Human League, ABC, Heaven 17, and Def Leppard. They actually don't have a lot in common, those groups, really. Certainly not Def Leppard. So I don't think I've answered your question, really. but I think it's
good stab at it. I think.
I think I don't know if the geography is important or not, except that I think people are using community sometimes. Don't know if this is still true either. It's hard to say.
What does being Welsh mean to you?
Really weird way to start the answer, but it's actually got easier for me, I think, partly because the sense of bilingualism has become much more accepted, I think. I still don't speak a lot of Welsh, but I understand more of it as time goes on, and especially written Welsh. And it's easier now to watch a drama on, say, S4C, because it will have subtitles, or you'll be able to read up about it. We did do it at school, but we had quite an ineffectual teacher at one point. I'd been quite good at it, but that didn't help, so we'd fallen behind. But as for Welshness, I used to struggle with it a bit, because when I was a kid, it was all about, do you like rugby union, really? Because in those days, Wales were winning everything in the 70s. And I must confess that I've never been able to really get on with it as a spectator, never mind as a player, because you had to play it at school. And I'll obviously root for Wales if they're playing England or whatever, and I will watch the game for other people. I think it's got a lot easier, because I think Wales does feel a long way from anywhere. So bands wouldn't tend to come very often. And if they did, I mean, the famous thing, I was talking to a friend the other night about this, was that the Smiths came to Swansea in 1984 to play an over-18s venue. And a friend of ours from school managed to go, but he was about 6 foot tall when he was 13. So he would have had no problem getting in. But the friend I was talking to, I said, well, I would have never passed for 18. And he said to me, yeah, well, I wasn't allowed to go. The only reason that this other friend of ours, who was the 6 foot tall friend, managed to get in was that his parents didn't mind him going to gigs. So he because when you're 30, it's different now. It's different because people
Yeah.
now go with their parents to gigs when they're kids, don't they? So we didn't do that. And my parents were sort of into pop music, but I mean, there wasn't anybody who I would have gone to see really. We have an arena now in Swansea, but we didn't have one then. And really, the only places to play would have been pubs or clubs or the university, or I mean, that was about it really. Brangwyn Hall, which was generally doing classical music. The other thing I'd say about Wales is that it does annoy me that we do get regarded as an afterthought, really. I mean, we're regarded as a useful part of Britain for people to have second homes in, and in what they think are the nice bits. So that's a problem. But I do sense that Wales is becoming more diverse, thankfully. It does feel like you can go and watch all sorts of things now. The fact that there's things like Pride events every year or all sorts of music being catered for now. Certainly when I see sort of younger people, they seem to be sort of driving things forward a bit.
The late 90s was quite a key moment with Super Furry Animals, Gorkies and Catatonia.
Yes, and although ironically, I sort of missed a lot of that because I left Cardiff at the start of 1997. I moved to London then, and so Super Furries were just coming up, and obviously the Manics were big already. But I mean, there was no one like that in the 80s in South Wales, really. I mean, there was Green Garts. I don't think I even knew he was Welsh then. I think I thought he was from Leeds because that's where he went to university. And Bonnie Tyler is from my village. She has a house here. Generally speaking, there were no new bands really. There was the Alarm from North Wales, and that was about it. And Shaky.
From your experience and knowledge, what do you see as the main attributes of northern people and places?
Well, touching on that thing I just said now about people moving, I made a list of my friends who are from the north of England, and some of them don't live there anymore. Some of them live in a different part of the north to where they grew up. Some of the other friends I have who live in the north aren't from the north at all. So there's that weird dislocation. The other thing is, I know some parts of the north better than others. So I barely know the northwest at all, actually. The middle bit of the north I know reasonably, Leeds and Sheffield and places like that. And the northeast I've been to literally once.
When we first met.
When we met, yeah. And so I hope to do that again. As I said earlier, I have this slightly distant relationship with the north. And so I think the attributes, I think it's changed actually. As when I was young, because we'd watched things like Coronation Street. Coronation Street was an absolutely massive thing in our house when I was growing up. And it's almost the first thing I remember on television, really. And I think the Welsh have a particular affinity with Coronation Street, actually. But I think there was something about the lugubriousness of northern humour, particularly. I mean, people like, Les Dawson's a favourite. And even when he wasn't doing the best material, I always thought he was a very likeable individual. Victoria Wood, obviously, Coogan later, and Carolina Hearn, people like that. There was the sort of an element of northern humour that I always enjoy. Partly because I think that idea of, Les Dawson got asked about this once, about how you're not playing at the lugubrious nature, that it's always this kind of fatalistic view of the world. But then he got asked, are you a depressive? And he said, oh, no, I'm not depressive. But it's just that I tend to start from the pessimistic.
Yeah.
Almost as if, it can't get any worse. And so I like, and that appeals to me sometimes. I'm getting less like that as I get older, funny enough. But I think that idea of the North is possibly not true anymore. But that might be just because more and more people are moving around, people are living in different places, people are getting more and more influences from other places. So I don't know if character types for areas are as true as they were. I don't know how you'd feel about that.
Yeah, everywhere changes.
Yeah, I think
over time. What's the number one myth about the North or northern people that you think needs consigning to history?
Maybe it's the one I just said. I don't know. There used to be this idea that there was quite a romanticised view about the North, I think. Don't know if that's still true now. Well, I think I used to probably think when I was a kid that everyone in the North was poor. And of course, it isn't true.
No.
If you go to areas of North Yorkshire, for example, it's not not the case at all. But then people used to think that about Wales, actually. Or it's like, well, there can't possibly be any Conservative voters in Wales. There are Conservative voters in Wales.
Yeah.
And the same in the North. It's always like, God, why are Yorkshire voting for the Tories? It's like there was always
been a fair few.
There you go. That's it. So, but if you look at different parts of the country, there's rich bits of all the parts, the parts of the country. I think there was always that element of that phrase, "I'll speak as I find," that kind of thing. I don't know if that's still the case or not about this idea of plain speaking. I think you get that everywhere. You certainly, increasingly getting it everywhere now. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that? You've probably answered this in other episodes. Because why is that question in there? Because have you noticed that there are stereotypes that you get fed up with, and
I think quite a few of the guests have resented the sort of stereotype that all Northerners are thick, say, particularly. I certainly agree with the one about everyone being poor as well. That it's just too simplistic. The view of all areas are very, very complex.
Yes.
The plain speaking one's a tough one, which I'd have to think about a lot more. It's difficult to make a generalization about that, really. There's over many million people in the north of England.
Of course. And the reason I mentioned that one is only because that's what supposedly people used to say that about Yorkshire.
Yeah.
That if you go to Yorkshire, the idea that everyone's like Jeff Boycott, it's not really true, firstly. But also I'm kind of interested in, where did that stereotype come from? Where do stereotypes come from? Why does this happen? I've always been intrigued by that, because you can't have met everybody. Do these come from popular characters, or?
Yeah, it's just something I'm going to explore in time with my research, definitely.
Yeah.
Do you think the North-South divide in Britain exists?
I think it probably doesn't as much as it used to. I think because people travel around a lot more, I don't think people have that idea of compartmentalizing the country anymore. I was thinking about, this is quite a niche thing to say, I suppose, but when I was young, and ITV, which is now a single entity, TV used to be split up into regions.
Yeah.
And so there were 15. And even though quite often programs didn't necessarily directly reflect what was going on in the region, particularly if they were trying to sell it to the network, there would always be this sense that a program that was made by Yorkshire Television would be different from a program that was being made by Tyne Tees or Granada or Central or whatever.
Yeah.
One of the unfortunate things now, I think, is that although programs do get made regionally, you don't really get a sense anymore that I suppose they would regard this as a strength, this idea that programs can be made anywhere now. So is it Belfast they make Mastermind in now, I think? So in one sense, you think, well, that's great, because it's just a program that they're able to employ program makers who are based in Belfast, for example. On the other hand, it's not really telling me anything about Belfast or Northern Ireland, that program. I think it's a shame that aspect of it has gone, that you're not necessarily reflecting what that part of the country might be like. And obviously it's unfair for me to just say Mastermind. That's just an example that came to mind. Apart from maybe the soaps are left where you're, and even then, I mean, isn't Emmerdale made in Manchester now, I think? It's not made in Leeds
anymore.
Not
quite as rooted as it was.
That's right. Yeah. So that you get a sense now that you don't get that sense of place quite as easily as maybe you did once upon a time. But that might reflect where we are with Britain. I don't know.
So from your relatively few visits to the north, what's been your favourite place?
This is a very personal answer. I've got to say Ilkley Moor, I think, because when I started going out with my partner, I had a relationship for about 20 years. She died this year, unfortunately. When we always stayed friends even after we split up. And when we first started going out, she was living in Leeds and I was living just outside London. So I would go up on the train and stay in Yorkshire. And we would often go to Ilkley Moor in that. She only lived there for the first year and then she moved down to London after that. But we'd go to Ilkley Moor quite often. And I just think the expanse of it was so amazing. I just used to really enjoy those days, because I think particularly when you're in an exciting new relationship and you're, it's just an amazing Expanse. I knew. I think I knew the song. I knew. On Ugly Will Bartak.
Oh
I
yeah.
knew the song, which had been the thing to go with Noakes, and amongst other things. This actually, oddly enough, kicks into what I was saying about how the image that you have of somewhere. I didn't know that there were these beautiful areas. Really, only 20 minutes out of Leeds, I think.
Yeah.
So I really, really enjoyed going there.
What's your least favourite place in the north and why?
I honestly don't have an answer for that. I can't even say, Crewe railway station, because I was stuck there for 3 hours one afternoon, because that's the one that I see people say that a lot. I've not had that misfortune. And I'd be interested to know what people have said for that answer, actually.
Yeah, we've had very diverse answers on that one. Do you have a favourite northern institution, organisation, or public space?
Okay, I will tell you this story, which is that in 1980, when I was 10, and it was the day that the actor Steve McQueen just died, actually, we went to the National Railway Museum in York on the train, and we very rarely went on the train anywhere. And the reason we went was that, I'm from Mumbles near Swansea, and with the Mumbles Railway, we had there's always this debate about whether it's the Stockton Railway or the Mumbles Railway that was the first regular one in the world. I'm not going to get too much into trains here, I promise. I'm not a trains expert, but my dad particularly wanted to see it, and my mum, because my mum and dad obviously remember Mumbles Railway, which closed at the beginning of the 60s because it was felt that we had enough motorised transport, we didn't need a train anymore, and all this kind of thing, which I think everyone's regretted since, because it's so difficult to park here now, and it's really, really crammed. But anyway, if you watch the BFI footage of the last Mumbles train journey, at the end, they smash up loads of the carriages with hammers and axes and things like that. Right. Because they think, we're not going to need these again. And there's only 2 carriages that survived, and one of them is on display in Swansea, and the other one is on display at the National Railway Museum in York. Anyway, we took the train to York and back in one day to go into the National Railway Museum, which is a long journey.
Yeah.
I think we were in York we must be only been in York for about 4 hours. Why we didn't stay over, God only knows. But anyway, my dad isn't here to ask anymore, so I can't ask him. But that was my first journey to the north ever, that museum. So I should probably say that, because it's the one place I've been to twice.
And what's your favourite northern book, graphic novel, photograph, or artwork? You only have to pick one out of those categories.
I think I was going to do something about Alan Bennett, one of the diaries, and I seem to have read Writing Home a lot. But then I suddenly thought this book Paul Morley wrote called Nothing, which was it's partly about his father's suicide, which happened at the height of punk rock. But what it really is about memory, and about how memory works. I think it's beautifully written, the beautifully written way that he gets other people involved and how they remember the father differently. And there's a really great section where he has his mum and his 2 sisters, one of whom obviously is Carol Morley, the filmmaker. That's a really great book, and I love the way that it's not written in order. So it's all about how memories connect and what he remembers about the day, and also how he leads you into the false sense of, I've only seen one dead body in my life. This is how it starts. You think it's going to be about his father's, but it isn't. It's Ian Curtis's. Because obviously, Tony Wilson thinks, well, you're going to write a book about Joy Division one day. Ironically, of course, Paul Morley's written a book about Tony Wilson now. But I think Nothing's his best book, actually. I actually think, God, you try about yourself a lot more, because actually, it's a dangerous thing to say to writers, I know. But I think that book is brilliant about how it connects everything. I go back to it every few years.
Yeah, I remember reading that when I was at university, that one. Yeah. It was
2000 it came out, I think, didn't it?
Yeah, so a couple of years after that. It's a great book. What's your favourite film or TV programme of any kind, set or shot in Northern England, and why?
Okay, this is a dead heat. I was either going to say The Tube, because that programme when I was a teenager was an absolute must, and I love the fact it didn't come from London. I love the fact that it was unpredictable. and it was live, and it was everything Top of the Pops wasn't, even though I liked Top of the Pops. My other contender is, I mean, it's not an obscure choice at all, but it's just come around on the Repeats channel again, and I've been watching it again, is Whatever Happened to the Lightning Lads. And what I really love about that program is I think it's one of the most honest, really honest portrayal of partly male friendship, but partly male antagonism. I think it's just, there's so much material in that. I'm kind of glad they didn't do any more. I think it might have struggled after that, actually. And I know not just because James Bond didn't want to do anymore. I mean, I love that those sequences. There's that episode where they're driving around Newcastle to show what's happening to the city since Terry Collier's been away. There's all these kind of buildings that are being knocked down or half being knocked down.
Yeah.
It's only recently that I was watching the sequence and realised that that bit where over the end credits, where they've got the kids playing on that front of the building that's there, you actually see them drive past that at one point in I think it's episode 3, where they're doing the location filming. The location filming in it's brilliant, because that's what really gives you a sense of when it is and how long ago it was, and it's really captured in time, that show. It's also very funny. Also, as I get older, I realise more and more how awful Bob Ferris actually is. When you're a kid, you think Terry Colley is the awful one, and he is awful in his own way. But I think Bob's worse. I think it's like he's an awful snob and a hypocrite. But I still think it's amazingly funny, and I still find it incredible that Clement Lafreniere apparently wrote most of it in Hollywood.
Interesting. I think that the film's actually pretty good, although the end section's a bit weaker. I remember it becomes a bit like any sort of sex comedy in the 70s. But the first 2/3, I think, are really good in that, the film, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you please nominate one unfairly overlooked Northern person to be on this podcast's Northerner roster?
I think I'm going to go for Janice Long, and I've dedicated the book to Janice Long.
Yeah.
I think she really didn't get the respect she deserved when she was here.
No.
And I think she's pretty much forgotten now. It's really because of Top of the Pops Repeats that she even gets remembered. Well, I used to love that evening show she did for Radio 1 in the 80s. There was a really great Billy Connolly interview that showed up on BBC Archive a couple of years ago, like a half hour, 40 minutes. And she just demonstrates how she's just such a brilliant listener in interviews. I mean, she gets written out a bit because Peel was important, but I think her work for Radio 1 was really important. I think she got treated incredibly shabbily because she had the audacity to be pregnant. For those people who don't know the story, she became pregnant and she was supposed to have 2 months maternity leave. They talked her into having 4 months maternity leave, and then they said, "Oh, could you come back, and we're getting rid of the evening show, but can you come back and do like our pick of the week show or something?" Which is basically a demotion.
Yeah.
And she told them to shove it, quite rightly. And you know, I think, although I mean, she did so much else after that, you know, and she did lots of telly, and she did Radio 2 for quite a number of years brilliantly as well, and eventually Radio Wales at the end of her life. I don't think I think it's one of Radio 1's worst moments really in the 80s. I think, you know, and obviously there are plenty of them, but you can't believe it happened in your lifetime, really, because you just think how, you know, I'm sure that was happening in every organization, but it just feels like, particularly for a station that was about young people, supposedly, that they didn't get that was, you know, they didn't know what they had.
Excellent choice. And could you please tell me your selections of 3 songs or pieces of music which deeply express the North to you?
Oh, this was really hard. I mean, there were just so, I mean, you know, I was going, oh, maybe I'll choose Unthanks, maybe I'll choose LFO, maybe I'll choose, or even then there might be Sheffield, but Warp Sheffield. Anyway, the 3 that I went, they all make me think of the city. So when I'm walking around the cities, or, you know, and I've got my MP3 player on, or it used to be my Walkman. So my first one would be Penthouse and Pavement by Heaven 17, because that was a favourite as when I was a teenager. There's a teenager on that record called John Wilson, who was a bass player, and this sort of clanking bass playing all over the record, which sounds really brilliant. But it's also got those sort of warm piano hooks as well. It's a really brilliant record. Mysteriously not a hit, but I think everyone had the album by the time they released that as a single.
Yeah.
So I'd have that one.
Fantastic. Great choice.
Thank you.
There's no pavement, no TV.
Talk and talk,
No time.
not time.
Burnt inside. Burnt inside. Burnt inside.
Here comes the daylight, here comes my job. Uptown in the penthouse, downtown with the mob. Here comes the nighttime, here comes my room. Goodbye to the pavement.
Yeah, I love that. Second choice would be Barry Adamson, and I could have chosen so many things, but Something Wicked This Way Comes, which probably most famous song really that he did, track. I love the way that it's got that sort of string part that never really resolves. It kind of keeps turning over and over and over. I didn't see Lost Highway, which it's in, for a long time. I basically knew it because it was in Blue Jam. We mentioned Chris Morris' Blue Jam earlier, and it was in the first episode of that. And I didn't know what it was. And when I found out what it was, I had to go and buy the album, Oedipus Schmiedipus. So I love that. He's just such a great arranger. And I just think he uses guest artists so well. My third choice is Lone Lady, Julie Campbell.
Oh, yeah.
And Hinterland. I mean, I'm going for the title track, but I could have chosen anything off that album, which she apparently made in her tower block flat in Manchester. It's so weird because I just can't imagine how you'd make that in your house, because it sounds such an amazing big record. Yeah, it doesn't sound constrained. I love that record. I think it came out about 10 years ago.
Let's go back to wander beyond the dirty window. There's a curious flame in the dark house of hinterland that keeps on calling me. In the dark house of hinterland, that's where I'll always be.
So those are my three, I would say. But they all make me think of sort of cityscapes and nighttime as well.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Those are some great choices, and thanks for talking today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Tom. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks.
Justin, have a good lunch.
No worries, Tom.
Cheers.
Thanks
Bye.
a lot, mate. Cheers now. Bye-bye. Bye.
That's it for this week on Hit the North. Conversations, editing, idents by Tom May.
Stings by Johnny Robinson.
Thanks to my guest Justin Lewis, talking on 18th September 2025. Music came from Ice Cube with Chris Morris Edition. The Special AKA, Heaven 17, Barry Adamson, and Lone Lady. Hang on! Want to be on the podcast or suggest a guest? Email hitthenorthne41@proton.me. Send us your favourite northern songs, places or stories there, or in the Hit the North Facebook group, and you'll get shout-outs. If you've enjoyed this, spread the word on social media or in person, and follow at Hit the North UK at bsky.social. Don't miss the Hit the North playlist on Spotify. Hit the North, manners!